Hey folks, making a quick video here on how to create unit tests for your React application. Jumping right into it, I have a simple application here that I bootstrapped using Create React App. One of the things that is really nice about creating applications with Create React App is that it automatically comes with a test script, which behind the scenes is configured to run Jest, which is pretty much the most popular JavaScript testing framework / runner. So that's what we're going to use today. So what we got over here is a very simple React component. All it does is it prints hello world on the screen. Very simple. So we're going to go over how to do the basics with testing this, and then we'll go and do a more complicated example. So to get started, we're going to create a new file that has the same name as the component, but we're going to add .test to the file name. And the reason for that is so that when we run Jest, it's automatically going to look for the file that has .test in it, and it's going to know that, oh, this must be a test file. Within this test file, we're going to write our first test, and the syntax is pretty simple. You just do it, and then you pass in a string over here, which would be your message, and then an arrow function. So there's not much here yet, but let's go ahead and run npm test just to see things in action. So this is going to run Jest. You'll see that it's running hello world.test. It automatically knows that that's a test because of the file name. And every time I change the code anywhere, either here or within the test itself, you'll notice that the test will automatically rerun. Notice that the string that we pass over here on the left actually becomes the name of the test down here. So you should make that into something more specific, like in our case, it should print out hello world. So right now we have an empty test. It doesn't actually do anything yet. So first of all, we need to add something here that actually allows us to kind of simulate rendering our hello world component. And what we're going to use for that is this thing called React testing library. So I'm going to open up another terminal. It tells me that I need to do npm install --save dev testing library /react. I'm going to copy that over. I'm also going to install this other library called Jest DOM, which is kind of like a companion library to React testing library. And I'll show you how to use that in a second. But first, let's install it. I'm going to copy this. So you'll notice I'm installing the two things there. Hit enter. So after React testing library is finished installing, you should be able to import it into your test. We're actually going to import two things here. One, we'll import the render and the screen methods from the library, React testing library, and then we're going to import the component that we're trying to test. So to get started, we're going to render our component. So what's happening here behind the scenes is you can kind of imagine that Jest is simulating a fake browser, and then it's rendering our component on that fake browser directly. So after you render your component, you can then start using this screen method here to start doing queries against that rendered component. So we know that our component is pretty simple. It pretty much just prints out hello world. So we should be able to write an assertion that validates that. To get started, I'm going to create a query using the screen object here, and I'm going to assign that to a variable called greeting. So I'm going to do screen.query by text, and then we're going to pass in the string that we're looking for. In this case, it's the hello world message that we have on the right side there. Okay. Once we have our query, we can then run our assertions. We can do expect greeting to be truthy. Notice that our test is still passing. That's because it ran this query, it tried to look for something on the screen that says hello world, and then we're expecting that it came back with something, right? If this was not able to find something, this would actually not be truthy, it will be undefined. So for example, if I change the text here to yo, we know that that's not on the screen, right? So this test is actually gonna fail because it tried to find it, came back with null, so it's not truthy, it fails. So back to the passing test, there's a couple of things here that we can further improve. First of all, to be truthy, while it's technically correct, it's not the best representation of what we're trying to do. There's actually one called to be in the document. This one comes from Jest, the other library that we installed earlier, and this better represents what we're trying to do, right? We're kind of simulating a micro fake browser, and we're going to put a component in there, and then we expect that within that document, in that fake browser, that there is a text that says hello world, right? So that's very much your bare bones basic test. A couple other things to point out here, you can actually also use screen.get by text. The difference is this will automatically fail the test if it doesn't find it. So for example, if I add a couple extra exclamation points here, it's not going to find that, right? Because we only have one on this side, and it's automatically going to fail the test. It will say, hey, I could not find this element. Also notice that you have to have the exact string here for it to be able to find it, as you can see, right? So what if you're only looking for part of the string, like you want to just find hello? How do you do that? You'll notice if I just provide hello, it'll actually fail because it doesn't find anything that is just hello. So if you want to do substrings, you can pass in a regular expression here like that. So that allows you to find partial strings. And then on top of that, you can add the I here if you're familiar with regular expressions, so that it ignores the case. So I can also do lowercase. So that's the bare bones basics of it. You know, you render something, you run some queries against it, and then you run some assertions to verify that your component works as you expect. Now let's jump into a more complicated example so that we can learn about the other things that you can do. So over here we have a very basic application. It simply has a list of items, and you can add to that list of items by typing into this input box. For example, if I type in something new and click add item, it adds it to the end of the list. Now if you're curious what that code looks like that runs this application on the right here, it's pretty basic, right? Like I said, there's effectively an array which we initialize to items A, B, and C, and then that state is managed internally by component state, and then we're also managing the state of the input box. And then every time we click add item, it simply takes the current name that's typed in and then adds it to the list and updates the state. Very simple. Let's go ahead and make a test for this. So I'm going to add a new file here, app.test. Again, remember to add that .test in the file name, and then we'll go back to our terminal down here to see that it is now running app.test. And right now we notice that it's failing because we haven't written anything yet. So before we write something, we talk about what are the different things that we want to assert about this mini application. So let's see, what are the things that it does? First of all, it should list out items A, B, and C initially, right? We have our initial state. It also should add a new item when user types in the box and submits. Okay. So just like before, we also need to make sure that we import render and screen from testing library, and then our app itself, our component itself. So how do we write this first test? Remember that you always have to start with the render. You have to render our component onto that fake browser. Now that the component is rendered, we can do our query. So for example, I can maybe do item A, similar thing to what we did before, get by text. Item A, and then I can do some assertions against that. Expect that item A to be in the document. Okay, so I assume that this is gonna pass. Okay, and then obviously you can just copy and paste this 3 times to get your A, B, and C if you wanted to. Another way to do something like this is perhaps I just want to query everything that starts with item. So you can also do get all by text, and then we're gonna utilize that substring idea that I mentioned earlier. We just want to get everything that has item in it, and again we're using get all here, which allows us to query more than one thing. I'm gonna rename this to be items, and then we can change up our assertion here a little bit to I expect that there's 3 items, so we can do expect items.length to equal 3. So this is actually failing because it's also finding the button that also says item on it. So that's a pretty good catch. To fix that, I'm gonna just simplify my button here to just say add. So now we're back to our working test. So as you can see here, it's pretty much up to you how specific you want your test to be. For example, originally we were looking to assert that items A, B, and C is being rendered. We've kind of made that a little bit more generic to just be, it should list out 3 initial items. So let's update that. So while we're at it, we might as well also update this test to effectively be the test that verifies that everything, all the little components within this render are there. So that includes not only our list items, but also the input box as well as the add button. So let's add that to our queries here. I'm gonna do button treating that get by text. And then we also need to be able to query our input box. And you might be wondering, how do you query something that doesn't have text assigned to it? And that's actually a good question, because the way that React Testing Library queries work is it kind of simulates the eye of the user, right? So for example, as you're scanning this application right here, you can visually see that there is an input box, but you don't know what that input box is for because it doesn't have a label to it, right? As a good practice, ideally you have labels assigned to your input boxes, because imagine if you had multiple inputs, right? A user would not know what each of those inputs are for. So ideally you have some form of labeling. So over here, we're gonna add a label, and we're just gonna call it name. And then we'll actually move our input inside that. All right. Now this application looks really ugly, I know, but we're not focusing on the CSS right now. We're just trying to understand the basics. So now that we have a label in there, over here in the test, we can do screen.get by label text, and we're going to utilize kind of the same strategy with, I just want to grab the one that has name as a substring of it, and I don't care about the case, you know, because maybe in the future I want to change that to be first name, right? Like maybe I want to change that to be first name, or maybe item name, or product name. No matter how much I change the implementation of that, this query will still work because it's always just looking for this substring name and it doesn't care about the case. That's why I have this I here. Okay, and now that we're able to find those two other elements on the screen, we can also do our assertions on them just like before. Expect button to be in the document. Same thing for input, just copy and paste this. All right. And then again, I'm going to update my message here to kind of capture what I'm doing in the test. So it should list out initial items and provide an input and a submit button. All right, so that's what I like to do usually with most components. I almost always have one test there that kind of just renders the component and asserts that all of my elements are in there. If you're not sure how to test your component, that's what you can start with. Just do that, render your component, find all the different elements and assert that they're there as you expect, right? Because kind of imagine if you have an application and the button is missing because you made a mistake, that's going to make your test fail, and then it's going to inform you that, hey, there's something over here that broke as you're changing the code. All right, now let's jump on over to our next test. So similarly for this one, we're going to render our component, and then I'm actually just going to lay out the structure of this test using comments for now, and then we'll talk about how to do the different pieces that's missing. So what are we trying to do here? We need to find the input, type in the input, and then we need to hit add, and then assert that the new item got added to the list. So we already know how to do most of this actually. So for example, how do we find the input? You can just copy this same exact snippet up here, put it over there, and then we also need to be able to find our button. So I'll copy this as well. Find the input and the button. And then we have to talk about how do you simulate typing and clicking. There's actually another library that you can use that testing library itself recommends. It's called the user event, and it's going to make this a lot simpler for us. So we're going to install that real quick. So in my terminal, I'm going to do that install. Now that that's finished installing, you can import it like this, top of the file. And then with this user event, you can do all sorts of things like clicking, typing, you know, most things that you would expect the user itself to do. So how do we type? Perhaps we want to type a name like Dustin. Okay, so we're gonna do user event dot type, and then first you gotta pass in the element that you're trying to type in. In our case, that's input, which we've already queried for up here. and then you just pass in the text that we're typing. So in that case, that's just Dustin, which is our variable name. Okay, and then we're also going to simulate. If you remember, our application has this add button. We're going to simulate clicking, so we can do user event.click button. Okay, and finally we're going to, and let me go back to the testing terminal here actually, so we can see what's going on. And finally, we're going to assert that if we do screen.get by text, and you can also pull this out into your variable if you want, or do it inline like this, it's up to you. So I'm expecting that there's a new item in there that has Dustin in it, which is in this name variable, and we're gonna do to be in the document, right? And expect this to pass, right? So what our test is effectively doing, if I refresh here on the right side, is it's typing in Dustin, it's clicking add, and then it's looking for this item, right? So how do we know that this is all working? Well, what if we didn't add that button click? I expect this to fail because there was never a submit. It's like the user just typed, but they never submitted, so it didn't get added. So that's working as expected. If you want, you can also remember that you can use query to test if something is not there. You can also do that. So you can add, for example, prior to submitting, you can assert that it's not there yet. So we're gonna do query by text, and then you can add .not here. Right, so we still have a passing test because it's finding the input, it types into it, it asserts that it hasn't been added yet. Not until we click the button, that's when we actually find that, oh, there's now a new item here that has the text Dustin in it. So there you go. That's pretty much your bare bones typical React component test. You know, so you just have to remember that the structure is almost always the same. It's always what are you trying to test? You know, it should do something, and then within your arrow function, you're gonna do a render, and then you're going to you can do some initial assertions. You know, like perhaps what does a component look like when it initially renders on the screen, and then you can do user events, so that includes typing, clicking, whatever, and then your final assertions. So those are things like how does the component look after the user acted upon it? You know, what's the behavior of that component, right? So if you remember this structure, that's pretty much most of testing. You notice most things look like, most tests will look like that. So I think the only other thing worth mentioning in this quick tutorial is that you can actually pass in props to your render. That's probably not obvious by the example so far. So as an example, if we were to update our hello world component to have a text prop, which just initializes to world, and we'll replace this to be text. So think of it as it's now a little bit more dynamic. It's not just the static hello world. If we go back to our test, you know, let's update this to be hello world. So that's still passing because initially it is a hello world. But what if you change the text to be Bob. Now this test will fail because it's unable to find hello world in this case, because in this render it's actually hello Bob. So let me update this. Right, so changing that to hello Bob allows it to pass. So that's another strategy, is if your component renders differently depending on the props that's passed in, you know, you can have individual tests for those different variations. So I showed you guys the very bare bones stuff that you need to understand to kind of get up and running, but you should understand that it's just scratching the surface, right? Make sure to check out the documentation for React testing libraries so that you're familiar with all of the other different API and queries that you can do. And then also check out the documentation for Jest DOM so that you know what are the different matchers that you can do. So we've mostly used to be in the document, right? There's a bunch of other things in here, like for example, to be visible, like maybe you're trying to test if a hidden component shows up after some kind of user event, or perhaps maybe you're trying to test something is disabled, like a submit button could be disabled until a user is done typing in the form. So there's a bunch of other stuff here that you can use to improve your assertions. You know, we did the very basic of, hey, find me this thing and make sure it's on the screen, but there's a bunch of other things that you can assert to further make your test actually useful. The general goal is you got to make sure that your test effectively represents how the user would use your application. You know, the closer your tests resemble how the user is using your application, the better your tests are. And it'll also help you capture, you know, errors that ideally that it's not something the user runs into. Ideally, your test is able to capture those errors before it goes to production, right? So that's it. That's the end of this video. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments.